Hi everybody, welcome to another Sussex Universe. Today we have Dr. Bryan Singer from psychology, and he will talk about the gambling brain. I never understood myself, so I'm a probabilist. So thank you, Bryan.
Thanks. Can everyone hear me okay? Good? Okay. Today I'll be talking about gambling, a bit about the brain. Just wanted to go over some trigger warnings today. I try to limit images and things like that might be triggering to some individuals, but there might be some left in there. I will be talking about some mental health conditions as well, and these might come up in the discussion afterward, as well as some animal models. If at any point you feel uncomfortable, it's fine to get up and leave. Okay, so the talk today will be in 4 parts. So first talk about background, then I'll give you a brief introduction to neurobiology because I know that you're not all neuroscientists or neurologists here. Then we'll talk about dopamine and gambling, and then finally end with a bit on treatment. There's not that much there because there aren't that many treatments for individuals that have problems with gambling. So what do I mean by gambling? So gambling in general, and this is from the Mayo Clinic's website, it means that you're willing to risk something you value in the hope of getting something even greater. So for some people, and this will be the large focus of today's presentation, gambling can be uncomfortable, uncontrollable, and take over their lives. If this happens, there are many places to seek help, and I can refer to these later on as well. But there are NHS GPs, there's the NHS Gambling Clinic, the Gaming Clinic, places like Gamblers Anonymous, GamLearn. These are local organizations, treatment services. There are different companies and organizations like Gamban, which provides blocking software to different websites. There are debt advice institutions and as well as Samaritans. So I just want to, in case anyone has issues with gambling, I just wanted to sort of bring these up now, as well as you can share these with your friends and family as well. Just a little bit of an introduction. So there are many different forms of gambling, and there's a lot of individual variation in participation. And individual variation is something that I study in my lab. So there's differences in participation by sex. More men than women tend to gamble. Consequently, and unfortunately, there's more research regarding men than women in both people and animal models. There's also differences in gambling participation by economic activity. So those who are unemployed might be more likely to gamble on slot machines or use bookmakers, whereas those that are employed tend to participate in more offline betting things and horse races and sporting events and things like that. By far the most popular type of gambling in the UK and probably around the world are the national lotteries. And also the biggest age group that participates in this are the 35 to 64-year-old range. Other types of lotteries and scratch cards are a lot less popular. Another thing I wanted to highlight, and I think this is a really important finding by a researcher, Margaret Wardle, who I believe is up in Scotland, is that gambling access varies across the UK and across communities in the world. I think the UK is very unique in that there are different sort of local betting shops pretty much all over the place. So this impacts gambling in many different ways. So in this paper from the Wardle lab, she tries to map out gambling machine density and areas of socioeconomic deprivation. And you can see in areas which high levels of gambling machines in red, they often overlie with areas that have higher levels of socioeconomic deprivation as well. So this is just an image of Manchester. There's parts of London that are particularly bad, like Kilburn Road. Seaside towns as well have this issue, in addition to places like Manchester, as shown here. So what did they find? They found that the distribution of gambling machines in Great Britain displays this significant association with socioeconomic deprivation. And I should say that this also is something to consider when trying to do comparative studies between gambling in the UK and gambling elsewhere in the world. There aren't as many, for example, in the US, where I'm from, gambling establishments all over the place. There are less cues about gambling in the environment, and so the individual's experience with gambling would probably be very different. So if you're doing a psychological study or a sociological study, you might get different results based on different countries. So I've given you a very brief introduction to gambling. What I'm going to be focusing most of my attention today is on problem gambling. So for some people, gambling can become uncontrollable and take over their life. So when diagnosing different mental health conditions, these tend to be listed in these two kind of manuals: the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Health Disorders, the DSM-5, as well as the International Classification of Diseases, the ICD-11. There are a lot of similarities here. Today I'm going to be focusing on the DSM-5. So in the DSM-5, there's a section on substance-related and addictive disorders. So we have all of these sort of different categories of drugs in this group. So alcohol, caffeine, cannabis, hallucinogens, etc. And you have are kind of graded or marked on the severity of symptoms. So within each of these categories, there are use disorders like alcohol use disorder. An individual might have 2 to 3 symptoms if they have a mild case, or 6 or more if they have a severe level of symptoms. There is a single non-substance related disorder in the DSM-5, and that is gambling disorder. There are other disorders that might be considered in the future, like gaming and things like that. But right now, it's only gambling disorder. So, gambling disorder, there are kind of 2 main criteria here. First off, you need 4 or more of these symptoms during a 12-month period. So, some of these include need to gamble with increasing amounts, being restless, repeated attempts to stop, preoccupied with gambling, anxiousness, losing money or chasing losses, which is something I'll bring up a little bit later, loss of jobs, family relationships, things like that. Now, the one thing I want to stress here is the symptom severity levels. So here we have 4 to 5 symptoms need to be accounted for a mild case. So this is very much different from the substance use disorders, which require 2 to 3 of these symptoms. So in practice, this means that having a diagnosis of a gambling disorder might actually be much more difficult than having a diagnosis of another addiction to a substance. Another important thing that I want to mention is that there is an extremely high lifetime comorbidity between gambling disorder and other mental health conditions. By comorbidity, I mean having 2 conditions or illnesses at the same time. I think a little bit later on, I'll talk about substance use disorder. I was going to talk about mood disorders today because that's something I'm actually researching in my lab today, overlap between schizophrenia and gambling disorder, but I'm not sure we'll get into that. In general, one of the sort of main surveys or questionnaires to assess gambling is the Problem Gambling Severity Index, the PGSI. It has 9 questions, and you can get a score of 0 to 27. So 0 is a non-problem gambler. Essentially, 1 to 2 is low risk, and 3 to 7 is moderate risk. And 8 plus is somebody who might be considered a problem gambler. And you can imagine, this goes all the way up to 27, so there is a big range for that problem gambler rating. So this has been very useful, but there's some interesting statistics, and this has actually been in the news very recently for many reasons, which I'll get into at the end of the talk. So this is from Health Survey England in 2021. It says that among adults who gambled in the last 12 months, PGS scores identified 5.8% as engaging in at-risk or problem gambling, compared to all those individuals who gambled online. So just 5.8%. And so that is the combination of essentially over here. So maybe moderate risk, maybe some individuals with low risk, but also problem gamblers. Now, if you just include problem gambling, the statistic drops significantly, maybe between 0.3 to 1% of the population. So this is a very, very low number. And this is what has been a bit controversial. So this was a letter posted earlier this year from the, or I guess end of last year, from the Gambling Commission about gambling companies and other organizations saying that there's just such a low, essentially saying that there's such a low proportion of people who are impacted by problem gambling that it might not be worth investigating or treating in general, or investing money in the treatment. So the issue that the Gambling Commission has raised here is that problem gambling means gambling to the degree that compromises or disrupts families, recreational pursuits, friends, things like that. The PGSI doesn't necessarily measure every impact that problematic gambling can have. It especially does not impact or measure harms that are experienced by both problem gamblers and those, including their family members. So what they state is that, these companies or organizations or individuals that claim that 99.7% of people who gamble aren't harmed, this is an inaccurate statement. There's a lot of harm that can be caused by gambling, but it's just not captured in this PGSI survey. So here are just some harms. I mentioned some of these. There's deaths from suicide, depression, alcohol dependence, illicit drug use, unemployment, things like that. So there's lots of harms that can be associated with gambling. These are costs to individuals as well as costs to society associated with them. So the Gambling Commission has realized that the PGSI is not capturing these harms, and that's having kind of a negative impact on how harm and gambling and problem gambling are perceived in the country and around the world. They've decided to start developing other surveys that try to better capture some of the harms related to gambling. So this is just one that I pulled from their website, I think yesterday or the day before yesterday, talking about how individuals cut back on spending in everyday arguments, whether they're getting into conflicts, whether they're feeling isolated, things like that. So they're trying to capture more of these harms. And one thing that I want to note before I go any further, and also because, I'm presenting today different articles, different research from kind of different time points. So terminology that was used in the 90s or aughts or teens might be different from what is used right now. So originally, according to diagnostic criteria, we referred to as problem gambling as pathological gambling. It's now referred to as problem gambling or gambling disorder. But you don't refer to an individual as a problem gambler. These are people. They are not defined only by this one behavior. So these are people who gamble despite experiencing problems or experiencing harms. So I try to keep my terminology the most politically correct and accurate as I can, but I might slip up from time to time. So I apologize for that. And it also gets confusing when you have similar abbreviations like PG for pathological gambling and PG for problem gambling. Okay. So hopefully that gives you a kind of a brief overview of the current state in the UK. I'll come back to some of those items in the treatment section because there are new laws and regulations that are possibly coming into effect regarding treatment and funding of treatment, which I think are important. So I know not everybody knows about the nervous system, so I'm going to give you a brief overview, a little whirlwind tour of the nervous system. So there are two divisions. The first is the central nervous system, which includes our brain and our spinal cord coming down here. And then there's the peripheral nervous system, which has kind of the rest of the body, the nerves of the somatic system that are involved in voluntary movement, as well as the autonomic nervous system, which involves, your typical sort of fight and flight responses and sort of controlling your everyday breathing and well-being. Today, I'm going to be ignoring most of that. Although, gambling does impact how we feel physically, so I can't completely ignore it. But I'm going to be mostly talking about the central nervous system and, in particular, the brain. So here is the brain. This figure is actually from an open access psychology textbook that our school put together, so you can access this if you want to learn more about the brain. Generally speaking, I'll give you kind of a brief overview of what we're going to be looking at today. So we have our sort of frontal cortices that, might help with sort of higher level planning or cognitive abilities, or maybe feeling, or in certain area, controlling feeling in certain areas of the body, or telling a certain area of the body to move. We have the cerebellum back here, which has lots of functions. Sometimes it mirrors what's happening in the rest of the brain. It's kind of like a little brain. Sometimes it's doing something else, like especially with movement. And we have different parts of the brain down here, which kind of go down to the spinal cord. Part that I'm going to be talking about today is the midbrain, and I'll come back to that in a second. A lot of the parts that I'm also going to be talking about today are kind of hidden deep inside the brain, so they don't necessarily show up in this diagram here. The brain has two major cell types. These are neurons and glia. I have neurons in red here because, like many neuroscientists, I kind of have a blind eye to glia, although they are very important. If you cut the brain in half, like this, you'll notice that there are some white areas and there are some more kind of gray areas along the sides. And this is kind of because of the structure of neurons. So the gray area is what we call the cell body, or kind of where a lot of the computation happens in the neuron, where the genes are expressed and proteins are made and things like that. So these cell bodies are gray in color, and they are sort of on the outside area, and as well as in some areas down here, as you can see. Then what you have are a white area here, and what this is, why it's white, is because it has something surrounding the neuron here called the myelin sheath. So this is actually a type of glia that helps with kind of electrical insulation, okay? So the neurons are communicating via electrical impulses, and basically insulating the neuron here helps the electrical impulses to travel further distances. So for example, if we have the cell bodies on the outside, then we have these myelin sheath coming down, and the neurons are trying to send these impulses to other parts of the brain. So that's why it's white. And then at the very end, and I'll focus on this in a few slides from now, we have the terminals. And these are the locations where communication happens to the next neuron. And I'll zoom on this in a second. I don't want to dwell on this too much, but I just want to say there's lots of types of cells in the brain. They don't all look the same. They don't all express the same chemicals. They don't do the same thing. In that cerebellum, the little brain that I showed you, the Purkinje cells that are very complicated, whereas areas such as, the cortex might have cells that are kind of complicated on both sides, but have a kind of more simple central area with maybe a nucleus in between. A lot of the cells that receive dopamine input look kind of like this. So they have a kind of that cell body, that nucleus in the center, and information receivers and senders on the outskirts like that. So I mentioned that neurons communicate via electrical signaling. Well, it's actually electrochemical signaling. So what you have here is an area called dendrites, and these dendrites first collect information from other neurons. This information is all taken up into the nucleus of the cell, the center area of it, and all that information is collected and sort of aggregated into a single message that's then sent via an electrical pulse down this part called the axon. And that electrical pulse is called an action potential. I won't go into the details of that today. Eventually, that action potential, the electrical pulse, reaches the very end again, on these sort of terminal areas where you can again communicate with another cell. So that location at the end where cells are communicating, that is called the synapse. And the molecule that is used to communicate at the synapse is called a neurotransmitter. So when electrical impulses reach that terminal region here, what happens is that all of a sudden these little channels on the membrane open up and they allow calcium to come into the cell. That calcium then causes a chain reaction of things which cause these little bubbles, I guess, that are filled with neurotransmitters to fuse and release into this area called the synapse. And those neurotransmitters then can bind to other cells. And the places that they bind to on other cells are called receptors, and I'll get into that in a second. But one interesting thing that you can do is to kind of do a pseudo recording of what neuronal activity looks like in the brain by recording calcium signaling. So this is going to be an image from a video from a zebrafish that has a genetically encoded sensor in it that essentially fluoresces when there's high levels of calcium. So you can see essentially the entire brain of that zebrafish sort of lighting up over time with these different action potentials. So there are different types of neurotransmitters. The most common excitable neurotransmitter that turns on things is called glutamate here. Most common inhibitory neurotransmitter that turns off things is called GABA. I'm going to mostly ignore those today and talk to you about dopamine. So here's the synapse. Again, a little bit of a blown up view of it. So we have these little bubbles that we call vesicles that are full of those neurotransmitters. They get released, and there's dopamine that's floating then in this synapse. That dopamine or whatever neurotransmitter is can then bind to other molecules, and we call these receptors. And when it binds to a receptor, it causes some sort of action to happen. For example, it might turn on this cell or turn off this cell, okay? And what happens here is very complicated. It depends on what type of neurotransmitter there is here, what type of receptor it can bind to. There are actually different types of dopamine receptors. Some are excitable and some are inhibitory. But you also have factors like, you get lots of dopamine, in this synapse here. What happens if the dopamine sort of flows out of the synapse? So you get sort of a reduced concentration of dopamine, and then there's less likely to bind to these receptors. Or what happens if you have enzymes that kind of eat up or break down the dopamine? Then there's less likely to activate these receptors. So there's lots of impact here and lots of things that can happen. So zooming in on the brain again, this is a side section of the brain. I mentioned that there are two areas in the midbrain that we'll be focusing on. These include the ventral tegmental area and some area called the substantia nigra. So these areas have the cell bodies of neurons that produce dopamine, okay? And these cells send projections, so send long axons to other areas of the brain. And those are shown by these sort of pink and blue lines. So just for reference, so rodents and humans have very similar structured brains, and this can enable some cross-species comparative research. So I think this is a bit of an easier way to sort of look at what areas I'm talking about today. So we have three different pathways, essentially. We have something called the nigrostriatal pathway, which starts in the substantia nigra and goes to areas which we call the dorsal striatum. We have the ventral tegmental area, which has two pathways. The mesolimbic pathway, this goes to the ventral striatum, including an area called the nucleus accumbens, which I'll talk to you about today, as well as other neurons that project up to the cortex. Before I get into the actual dopamine data, I just wanted to mention that there are two different techniques that I'll be discussing today that enable us to look at dopamine in the human brain, or at least brain activity. The first is positron emission tomography. So what this involves is essentially injecting an individual with a radioactive tracer, and this tracer might bind to something like that dopamine receptor that I mentioned before, okay? So the individual is put into this machine, and the tracer is going to fluoresce in the brain wherever it's bound to, okay? So if there are lots of dopamine receptors in this area of the brain, which is shown by this red here, that means that's where the radioactive tracer is going to bind to, okay? So this is a really cool way, I think, of looking at how dopamine is impacting the brain. And you can do different experiments. So for example, we can inject an individual with some sort of stimulant or drug that causes lots of dopamine to be released, okay? So that dopamine is then competing with that radioactive tracer to bind to those same receptors. So then you get this sort of paradoxical image here where it looks like you actually have less activity here. Well, there's less fluorescence because there are not enough sort of receptors for that radioactive tracer to bind to. You don't have to know that much detail today. Another way of imaging the brain is functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI. This is sort of a structural way that we look at sort of blood flow in different areas. And that's important because when areas of the brain are very active, okay, they use energy and you get more blood flow to those areas. So we can use this type of imaging to essentially look at what areas of the brain are active. You're not looking at dopamine levels, you're looking at brain activity. So it's a little bit of a different technique. I think it's a little bit cheaper and less invasive than PET scans. Okay, so I've finally gotten to the part where you probably came here to learn about, which is dopamine and gambling. So I think the first bit of evidence comes from patients. And these are not the patients that you might think that I'm going to talk to you about. So Parkinson's disease. Parkinson's disease is a neurodegenerative disease which results in the gradual loss of dopamine neurons, in particular that area that I showed you before, the substantia nigra. Okay? So one treatment for Parkinson's disease is giving some sort of dopamine replacement therapy. So you're replacing the dopamine that's essentially being lost because there's not enough dopamine being produced by the brain. So what happens in some individuals with some types of therapies is that these drug treatments tend to turn on dopamine receptors, and that might facilitate gambling. And so this has been shown in various locations throughout the world that some treatments for Parkinson's disease cause individuals to start doing certain risky behaviors or impulsive behaviors like gambling, even if they've never gambled in their lives before. Okay? So this is sort of evidence that, adding dopamine to the system can cause issues. I do want to highlight, though, that we can't overgeneralize the role of dopamine for addiction. And of course, I'm sort of ignoring lots of other neurochemicals as well today. Dopamine levels might be related to very specific gambling-related behaviors. And I just want to remind you here again that these are some of them. So, for example, loss chasing, or feeling anxious or depressed, or being preoccupied, or having unsuccessful efforts to decrease gambling. Okay, so dopamine might be related to some of these features of gambling, but not all of them. So I'll give you a few brain imaging nuggets of information about what dopamine might be doing. I think this is still a very controversial and evolving field, but I think this is a good place to start. So in general, the studies I'm going to show you show greater dopamine signaling, either in the ventral striatum or in the midbrain, for people who gamble despite experiencing problems or experiencing harms. And these data are going to be comparing those individuals to what we refer to as healthy controls, those individuals that don't gamble or don't gamble to a degree that it causes problems. So the first study that I want to show you is about gambling and excitement. So in individuals who might gamble despite having problems, increased levels of gambling tend to be associated with more excitement, okay? And this excitement is also associated with poor performance on lab-based gambling tasks, okay? So they find gambling exciting, and dopamine might be mediating some of that. Another study also found that gambling in individuals that have gambling despite problems, they might have worse mood-related impulsivity, acting rashly or impulsively, and these are associated with also increases in dopamine levels in the ventral striatum or in the midbrain. So those are two kind of big pieces of evidence in addition to the Parkinson's disease evidence I showed you. A couple other things. So I mentioned, according to those DSM-5 criteria, loss chasing. So this is an example of loss chasing. So in individuals who are chasing losses, they have a bigger dopamine response in certain areas of the brain compared to when they're not chasing losses. So they seem to have this excess motivation to gamble despite this negative impact of losing money. And it's not just about, loss chasing. It's about this thing called near misses. So a gambler experiencing something a situation where they almost win, but did not quite win. And so there's also increased brain activity in areas that are receiving dopamine input during these near misses for gamblers, but not in individuals that do not gamble. Okay? So these are two big facets of information that suggest dopamine's role in gambling. And I think these actually relate to other addictions as well. I think there's a lot of neurobiological overlap between substance use disorders and gambling disorder. These findings, I think, suggest that dopamine might drive people or motivate people to keep gambling, even if they don't want to, even if they're losing money. And this resembles something called the incentive salience or incentive value model of addiction. So in this model, with repeated drug exposure, it's thought that wanting or desire for a drug keeps on increasing and increasing, okay? And this is facilitated by increases in dopamine transmission in the brain. So that's what we have here. So this increase in wanting, increased drug intake. And this happens despite the individual not really liking the drug anymore in many cases. They're not enjoying it. They're not getting pleasure from it. So there's this dissociation between liking and wanting. And I think the same thing happens for gambling as well. As if you talk to a lot of individuals who gamble, despite problems, they don't necessarily say they do it to earn money or they don't like it. They do it because they feel like they're forced to. They have to sort of, accommodate that loss chasing or get past that near miss. It's not necessarily about winning money anymore. The other thing that's important here is that this behavior, this enhanced dopamine signaling that drives wanting, really gets exaggerated in the presence of cues that predict drug, okay? And these cues are often very highly salient and can motivate people to relapse into drug use. So this leads to the second part of this sort of dopamine section, and that's, what about these cues? Are these cues important to decision making? Are they important to sort of motivating people to continue gambling despite not wanting to? So a little bit of a psychology here that I'm sure you're all familiar with, but this is classical Pavlovian conditioning that I'm talking about. You have an unconditioned stimulus, which for this dog is a steak that's very tasty, and an unconditioned response, which is this salvation, kind of getting ready to eat the steak. But then you come along and have this conditioned stimulus that might be a bell that's paired with the steak. So the animal learns this, and this is called appetitive conditioning, because there's something rewarding that's being predicted by this bell. And the animal or individual develops a conditioned response. So you ring that bell, and the animal starts salivating. It's getting ready to consume. And you can imagine that gambling cues are like this as well. Okay? An individual sees a cue associated with gambling, and that might cause them to want to gamble or get ready to gamble. And this is just an example here. So gambling environments and commercials are awash with audiovisual stimuli designed to drive betting behavior. Okay, so this is just an example of a game. You have these flashing lights that tell you to spin. The individual might be staring at that. They might be staring at this reward counter telling them how much money they have. They might be staring at these scrolling fruit icons, which might tell them if they have that near miss or not. There's lots of cues in this environment. And people who experience problem gambling might allocate excess attention to these different cues. And these can have physiological impacts. So these might actually be related to those autonomic functions that I mentioned earlier. So physiology, increased heart rate, there might be increased brain activity, like I also showed you. There might be different cognitive states that are elicited as well, like desire to gamble, overestimation of wins, taking risks, poor decision-making, things like that. And I decided to put this up because this is an example of lots of cues kind of going on in multiple ways. So yes, there's the whole football element here. So you watch any football game, you see, Betway or other gambling companies are advertised all over the place. But this is not actually an image from a football game. Does anyone know what this is an image from? Not cricket. Ted Lasso. Yes, so this is a TV program, I think, on Apple TV, I believe. So this is Ted Lasso. And even within that program, they still have all of the gambling ads in there, which I think is absolutely fascinating. And, talks about the power of the gambling industry and the relationships with the Premier League and things like that they need to include these in a television show. But even in a drama or a comedy, you're seeing these betting ads about football. So how does dopamine encode reward learning and uncertainty? So there are a few things to note here. So first, cues. So these are, what I'm showing you here are recordings of neuronal activity. in the midbrain, so in an area like the ventral tegmental area that includes those dopamine neurons. So what you can see is if you record their activity, so like those calcium spikes that I showed you in that video, you can see that when there's a stimulus that later predicts reward, dopamine neurons have this big spike of activity. So they're predicting that something is going to happen. So cues are learned about, and dopamine is telling you to sort of get ready for that reward that's going to happen, okay? So that's one thing. The other thing I want to note here is this ramping up effect. And I think this effect actually gets forgotten a lot in the literature. So oftentimes, and this doesn't happen in all cells, but in some cells, there's this gradual increase in dopamine neuron activity between the time there's a cue and when you're supposed to get the reward. And it just so happens that this ramping up of activity is most prominent when there's the most degree of uncertainty. So we don't know here whether there's reward or not. That cue is 50% predictive, and you get this big ramping up of these dopamine neuron firing. So dopamine seems to be encoding both cue-related learning as well as this uncertainty. So gambling-like uncertainty might increase this dopamine neuron activity in multiple ways. So this enhancement in activity could be magnified by drugs of abuse. And that's especially true because misused drugs also cause increase in dopamine signaling. So I mentioned this before when I talked about the incentive salience model, where you get the sensitization or enhancement of dopamine levels. And this is important here because remember, there's lots of comorbidity, especially between substance use disorders and gambling disorders. Okay? And so you have things like reward uncertainty, gambling, exposure to drugs of abuse and alcohol, exposure to stress and anxiety, and all of these things interact to sort of ramp up the system, and they might contribute to the state of addiction. So, research has been investigating whether some individuals are more attracted to gambling cues than others, and whether this impacts behavior. So this is an area of research that I'm doing in the lab. And we're looking at the neurobiology of this using some animal models. So again, using this example, it's possible that some people are really attracted to that spin buttoning, keep on pressing it and pressing it and pressing it, whereas other individuals are more focused on that location of the money information. So what we found and other people have found is that there's individual variation in how cues evoke behavior in both people as well as in animals. So in this type of experiment, what we have are a Pavlovian conditioning experiment in rats. What you have is a lever that comes out and then retracts, and then a reward pellet, maybe a little sucrose pellet, is delivered. The rats don't have to do anything. That lever is just a cue that predicts reward. And what you find are two different conditioned responses. So in one rat, what you might find is that they engage with that lever. They kind of attack it, they want it, they nibble on it, they press it, they interact with it. We call these rats sign trackers because they're really interested in the sign that predicts the reward. They're really interested in the cues. Other rats completely ignore the lever, okay? Well, maybe not completely. They might look over it and say, oh, something happened, but then they go directly to the food cup and start waiting for this food reward to be delivered, okay? So there's this very sort of interesting individual variation here. And it just so happens that this individual variation is driven in part by dopamine signaling in the brain. So in these rats that are really attracted to those cues, they have this big dopamine spike when they see the cue. They don't have much of a dopamine spike when they get the reward, maybe because they don't care about the reward as much, I don't know. But those other rats that don't engage with the cue, they don't show this stark difference between dopamine to the cue and dopamine to the reward. You can do different manipulations, and you see that this dopamine response here is necessary and sufficient for that attraction to the cue. It's needed. So, because of this, we think that this big dopamine response in these rats we call sign trackers means that cues are very attention-grabbing to them and might motivate their behavior. And because of that, I'll hurry this up a bit because I know we're getting a little low on time. We think these rats are good models of various forms of addiction. In fact, they're really motivated by drug cues. They have high levels of impulsivity. They display gambling behavior, which I'll show you in a second. People also sign track. They're attracted to cues, and high-risk gamblers tend to approach gambling cues more than low-risk gamblers. And the other thing is that sign trackers continue pursuing reward even when reward is no longer available. They continue to work at that cue even if that cue is no longer predictive of reward. And we see this in people too. So continued betting despite infrequent winnings, experiencing losses disguised as wins, and really having these emotionally salient gambling cues really take over behavior and sort of drive people to continue gambling, even at the expense of other things. So this is just an example of a gambling-like task. It's not perfect, but it is a gambling-like task that a rodent might do. Rodents like to poke their nose into different holes. And in this example, there are different holes that have different rewards and different probabilities of getting a reward. So for example, this hole here might get a 40% chance of the rat or mouse receiving 4 reward pellets, whereas this hole here has a 90% chance of the rat receiving 1 pellet. Okay? And so you can look at whether, rats are taking these more risky options versus some of these kind of more safer and even optimal options. Okay? And what we find is that the sign trackers actually are kind of doing as we suspect, in that they're taking less of these safe rewards and more of these risky rewards. Okay? So they prefer that big reward that's only given to them 40% of the time. So they're doing much more gambling-like behavior. In addition, they're more impulsive. So they basically respond too soon, for example, on different tasks. They can't sort of withhold their actions. So they're risk takers, and they're impulsive. So I'm not going to go into more sort of neurobiological detail of this, but what I want to say is what we've been doing in the lab is kind of taking qualitative research from humans and designing studies using rodents based on those research. So for example, what we aim to do is kind of decrease risky choices in a sign tracker, or decrease impulsivity in a sign tracker based on what we find in the human literature. So for example, one thing that we've been doing right now is looking at this drug, olanzapine. There have been some small clinical trials of olanzapine suggesting that it might be helpful to help people stop gambling, but the evidence is really mixed. And so we've been working with clinicians to start testing different doses of olanzapine, different regimens of olanzapine, to see if we can start getting down those risky choices in the sign trackers. Okay. And the one thing I want to say as well before I move on to the last section is sign tracking is not just an animal thing. We're doing it in people as well, in multiple ways. So we have a physical room, which right now is actually, it's back here at Sussex, but when this image was from King's College, it's a physical room that has cues on the wall. It has a dog treat dispenser that I rigged up to spit out different treats and things like that when the cues turn on and off. And we can monitor people's position via video and assess what people are doing. whether they're sign trackers or goal trackers. And we can do the same thing in virtual reality, for example. Interesting thing with people is we get a little bit more nuance. Not only do we find that there are sign trackers and goal trackers, we also find individuals that we call instrumental-like. So they think that their action is actually having a consequence when it really doesn't. They think that they need to press that button to get that reward, but they don't because it's a Pavlovian task. And we can't really detect that in an animal model, but we can ask people what they're thinking. So this is very useful. Okay, in the last few minutes, I want to talk about treatment. So I mentioned pharmacotherapy, olanzapine that we've been testing out. In general, there are very few medicines that are used for gambling. In fact, basically none. The one that is used in the UK and in some places with varying degrees of success is a opioid receptor antagonist. Notice it's not dopamine, so that's an interesting point there. We don't really know too much about the opioid system and gambling, so that might be an area for research. But looking at this, this is a clinical trial, I guess, for naltrexone. And you can see that over time, individuals, compared to sort of a control group, but individuals that got naltrexone are gambling less. Unfortunately, what happens is naltrexone has lots of different side effects. So, 40% of people have dry mouth, not 45 nausea. So this causes a lot of people to not want to take naltrexone. Indeed, naltrexone is to some degree impacting our pleasure system as well. So it might not be the most pleasant thing to take. And that's a problem, which is why there need to be alternatives. There's psychological therapies, cognitive behavioral therapy, family therapy, there's self-help groups, there's Gamblers Anonymous, there's social support groups as well. There are residential homes, so I took this off the BBC website relatively recently, UK's first women-only residential home for gamblers. But the last thing I want to sort of leave you with is that more research need to be developed to improve treatments. And this kind of goes back to some of the laws and regulations that I started talking about today. So the Gambling Act of 2005 regulates gambling in Britain. It has 3 objectives: to prevent gambling, ensuring gambling is conducted in a fair way, protect children and the vulnerable. So the act was overseen, or is overseen, by the Gambling Commission, and there's a statement in it, section 123, that says that the Secretary of State for Digital Culture and Media and Sport can make regulations that require companies to pay an annual levy to the Commission to support things like individuals that have addiction to gambling and to reduce harms. Section 123 never happened, never commenced. Right now, licensed operators can make a voluntary contribution of 0.1% towards research and prevention of the treatment of gambling-related harm. So, what's happened recently, and this has been many years, obviously since 2005, in the coming, is that there's been this white paper that was recently released about a gambling levy. So in this white paper, essentially all online operators will pay around 1% of their earnings to this levy. There are other types of operators that, again, go down to 0.1%. But importantly, for people, this levy has a very specific way of being distributed. That's unlike the voluntary distribution of funds that's happening now. So it's going to go to research, or it's proposed to go to research, prevention, and treatment. Okay? So this is very much sort of an ongoing thing. Okay, 3 minutes. So just to summarize what I've talked to you about today, gambling can be an enjoyable activity for many people, but in fact for most people, but some individuals continue to gamble despite experiencing harm. There are levels of uncertainty that might impact how the brain perceives gambling situations. These might be related to dopamine signaling in the brain, and they might become exaggerated in certain individuals, maybe to chase losses and things like that. There are different psychological therapies that can be used for gambling, but there currently aren't any widely accepted medications other than potentially naltrexone. When developing treatments, it's important to think about comorbidities. So those other substance use disorders, those other affective disorders, things like that. And finally, there's this evolving state of regulation in the UK, what I just talked to you about just now, especially in terms of regarding how apps and online gambling are treated, and what will happen still remains unclear. So with that, I want to thank people that helped with this in my lab, particularly some of the gambling stuff was done by Rudy. There are a couple of brief announcements that I've been asked to put here. One was about the next Sussex Universe talk, which will be on Tuesday, April 16th at 6 p.m. Mathematics of Life from Epidemics to Sex and Time-Delayed Systems. So there is one, hopefully people are scanning that or at least taking a note of that, because there's also another talk that's coming up on historical representation of women in mathematics by Professor June Barrow-Green from the Open University. And that will be happening, is that tomorrow?
That's tomorrow.
That's tomorrow. Great. So thank you.